The Owl House and Amphibia invite comparisons between them. For a number of reasons. They are both shows that started airing around the same time. They're both shows that were started and show run by disciples of Alex Hirsch, people who worked in a creative role on Gravity Falls. And in an obvious way, they are similar in that they are both shows about girls around the same age who get trapped in a different world and have to adapt to the strange and magical experiences of that world, a world that fundamentally transcends and overwhelms their preconceptions and expectations. I like both shows. I would say The Owl House is probably a little bit better, if only because it's more consistent. But I think Amphibia is probably the more ambitious show. It tries a lot of things. They don't always work, but when they do, it's magical. True Colors, the Season 2 finale of Amphibia, is probably an episode I like more than any episode of The Owl House. And the ending of Amphibia, while I quibble with it, is, at least on a conceptual level, more interesting to me than the Owl House's ending of everyone gets what they want, more or less. There's nothing wrong with the Owl House's ending. It's good. It's fitting for the show. Everyone gets a happy ending except Belos, more or less, and the Collector goes on his own Buildings Roman quest, his own coming-of-age journey. But I will say that one area wherein the Owl House doesn't quite match up to Amphibia is in its main villain. Belos and Andrias are both terrifying. They both evoke fear and dread. There's a sense of power and energy and megalomaniacal vitality to both characters. But ultimately, Andrias' story is tragic in a way that Belos' isn't, and doesn't really even try to be. Now, I'm not saying every villain needs to have a tragic story, but I do believe that the complete lack of tragedy in Belos' narrative is a major reason why it does not work for me nearly as well as Andrias in Amphibia. Belos is fine, he's adequate, but he never became a full character in the same way that Andrias absolutely does. Now, to be clear, when I say tragic, I do not mean tragic in the merely mundane sense of, oh hey, something bad happened to this character, they have a tragic backstory. 90% of the time when people say that, they don't mean that the character's story is actually tragic in any strict, distinct sense of that word, but simply that they had unfortunate things happen to them. Andrias' story actually is tragic, though, in the classical sense of that term. I am going to use for my broad framework for what the best kinds of tragedy are the definitions set forth by Aristotle in his Poetics. It's a great book. Really short, very dense, confusing at times, but ultimately great. I would recommend reading it if you haven't. It is basically a poetic, philosophical work looking at what Aristotle considers to be the foundations, the basic building blocks for a good, affecting tragedy. There are a lot of interesting points in his work, such as that character is not enough to make a tragedy. What is important is action, characters in motion, characters making choices. Being unchanging and not responding to any outside circumstances is not the proper stuff of narrative storytelling for Aristotle. Narrative storytelling is about choices. It's about the decisions characters make based on the circumstances they are in, placed in the sequence of events. This is probably a somewhat familiar definition to us, even if we are not particularly conscious of it. And I do believe this is what separates narrative storytelling from, say, the lyric, either the old poetic lyric or song lyrics nowadays. It is not just, oh hey, I got broken up with and I'm feeling sad. It is, I am starting in one position, I suffer this action, say, the heartbreak, and I respond to it, and that has ripple effects on both myself and others. That, for Aristotle, is storytelling. And for him, this elevates narrative storytelling above other forms of art. I wouldn't go that far, but he makes a distinct case. But the major aspect of tragedy that Aristotle sets out is his discussion on what he calls anagnorisis. This is what I'm going to focus on. Anagnorisis is a simple term, but one worth dwelling on. It is more or less where the tragic character has a moment of realization, a moment of revelation, a moment wherein they realize that the choices they have made, while perhaps inevitable, or at least almost inevitable given their circumstances and given the actions taken from a place of ignorance in the past, ultimately led to a position where one realizes how doomed one is. Belos as a character is not capable of that kind of reflection. I don't think that is a particularly controversial statement. I do not think Belos is a useless character. I do not think he is a thematically empty character. The parallels between him and Luce are quite effective in how they elucidate a productive versus an unproductive response to being in an unfamiliar world and having your preconceived notions challenged. Belos responds by becoming cynical and antisocial to the point of being megalomaniacal and ultimately desiring to wipe out all the witches. Luce responds the exact opposite way. She accepts this new world, not simply as the basic idea she has of it as this wonderful, wonderful place at the start of the show, but as a dynamic place that is constantly revealing secrets to her. She accepts this place in its fullness, in its multiplicity, and she accepts the different kinds of people that she meets and interacts with. Still, I believe the show could have done a little more to emphasize the parallels between them. It's not that the parallels aren't there, it's that we never fear that Luce is going to turn out like Belos. She might make some mistakes, she might choose a few foolish or selfish actions, but she is fundamentally not going to become some maniac who attempts to shape the world to very horrific whims by exterminating all those who don't fit an ideal, perfect conception of justice and purity. Amphibia is a bit different. The parallels between Marcy and King Andrias are similar to those between Luce and Belos, but they go a bit further. Andrias, as we learn in the final season of Amphibia, ultimately not only was not a horrible, horrible person from back on day one, but nonetheless yearned desperately to keep in touch with the people he cared about, keep in touch with these friendships. These friendships, it seems, meant more to Andrias than anything. And his friends are not without fault. I'm not excusing Andrias' behavior. I'm just saying that if his friends had stayed and tried to change his mind, they might have had a better effect on him than what happened when they just left him, deprived him of their moderating influence, and thus drove him deeper into this place of rage and vengeance. He wanted more than anything to keep his friends with him, and without them, he becomes far more desperate. Marcy is also desperate to keep her friends with her at all costs, and she is willing to make choices that are rather selfish and cold and manipulative in order to have that sense of connection that she craves so deeply. The parallel between her and Andrias is very close. One can totally understand what Andrias sees in Marcy. He does deeply understand her desires, and while he manipulates her, he does really care about her, and he does share a lot of her feelings. He recognizes some part of the person he once was in Marcy. And also, by the end, Andrias realizes that he could have changed. That even though he did suffer this terrible heartbreak in losing his friends for reasons that were not entirely within his control, he did not have to succumb to vengeance, to this megalomaniacal, cold idea of the world, and thus follow in his father's footsteps. It is perhaps natural that he did, considering the circumstances we see him in the backstories, but nonetheless, the idea that he could have gone another way is made clear to him by the end of the show, and he feels this deeply. He deeply understands the pain he has caused not just others, but himself in making the choices that he did. He closed himself off from the opportunities he had to grow and mature and look beyond the narrow conception of the world pressed into him by his father and his overall milieu. That recognition is painful and clarifying to him. It's a true moment of anagnorisis. And that alone makes Andrias' narrative far more poignant and devastating than Belos' narrative ever approaches at any point in the show. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can. If you want to see more videos like this before anyone else, tell me what you think about Belos and Andrias in the comments below. Do you disagree with me? If so, tell me why. Anyway, adios, comrades.